The Why Didn't You Test That podcast want to improve your software. Join Hugh, Rich and their guests. They share experiences and insights on the many sides of better software delivery.
Hello again, we're back. It is Hugh and Rich once more, and we are joined by the legend that is Paul Gerrard. I've known him for many years. You may well have listened to him speak at various conferences. We're normally somewhere sitting in a bar in Copenhagen or somewhere like that, discussing what's right and what's wrong with the industry. Yeah, so I think Paul is a creative thinker. He's always prodding and poking and challenging, and I think that was probably one of the key messages from his keynote at Eurostar last year. So I think, just to kind of fill you in a bit, Paul. So I think Rich and I and our various guests have kind of explored quite a lot what's wrong with the industry. The reality is that most systems are late and of relatively poor quality, with some massive, outliers where they're doing a really, really good job. So I think maybe what we'll try and do today is brainstorm a little bit between us about what people can actually do, what sort of small, medium, long term, maybe just starting with a few small things, moving on to some medium things that have actually made a significant difference to the speed and the quality. And that's kind of what it's about. Maintainability, testability, all of those types of things that kind of drop out of what we're really all about at the moment. And I think most managers would probably agree that there are some issues. And then I think, if they can just pick up maybe one or two things here from us that might lead them down a path or might just actually give them a few quick wins to improve a few things. So I'm just going to hand over to Rich now, just to kind of, so you can add a bit of color, and then we'll let unleash Paul for a little bit and then maybe turn it more into a conversation. So Rich, what are your thoughts on this?
So I think, based on my experience, and some of this might be quite boring, right? And it kind of very much feeds into the go slower to go faster kind of mantra in terms of, I think a lot of companies, teams are very technology centric, and they're looking for the next big technology solution to solve a problem that isn't necessarily a technology problem. My history of kind of working within test teams and trying to get automation working, kind of failed to do those things a lot, right? And I had the fortunate I didn't see it at the time, but the fortunate gift, if you like, of taking over a test data team at the time, right? And trying to understand what does it mean to make a test data team work. And we built out a technology capability. Coincidentally, it was with a past company of yourself, Hugh, and we had a solution that was brilliant, but didn't necessarily solve a problem. Okay, because we didn't really look at what the problem was underneath the covers, and a lot of the time it was around that fact that people didn't really understand what they were testing, people didn't really understand how the systems were supposed to work. And back to my point, go slower to go faster. What we found is actually taking the time to do more analysis up front, and I don't mean analysis paralysis on this, I mean analysis to do enough to get consensus to move forward to the next iteration, to build out. And I don't know whether Paul regrets coming up with this at the time, but the kind of the new model for testing, to build out a model of what we're trying to achieve to get consensus, to get transparency, that although perceived possibly to be over analysis, I can't kind of applaud teams enough for doing that to get ultimately the industrialization fundamentals in place to actually accelerate far quicker. And I think there is so much to getting those fundamental pieces in place that allow people to be agile with a little a, far more than they ever would looking at the kind of the next kind of technology that proposes to do those things. I don't know, I'll open it up there to yourself, Paul, in terms of first question, do you regret that model? Because I'm sure lots of people come back to it.
No, well, I could say certainly not. No, what I would say is I mean, touching on a couple of themes you mentioned there about sort of, what you called analysis and just getting closer to the problem, let's say, rather than getting too embattled and embittered with the supposed solution. I mean, the first thing I would say is you can't get close enough to your stakeholders. Now, one of the things, what I call stakeholders, the people who are the customers of what you do. So when you test and you produce some knowledge, some information, a report, whatever it is, in whatever format, that is going to be taken by someone else usually to make some kind of decision, either to fix a bug, to release a system, to transition to another state another stage in a project, to abandon the project completely, to have another meeting about requirements, whatever. Okay, so everything you do as a tester, I think, has value. One of the problems we have is the value is in the eye of those stakeholders. So the closer we can get to those stakeholders to know what they want from us, the better. Sometimes it's difficult because big organizations often have layers of hierarchies and layers and buffers between you and the real source of knowledge and so on and so forth. But a question I always ask when I get down and dirty with the testers and saying, look, what could we do better in this part of the world? I usually ask, so, well, who's your stakeholders? And they usually look a little bit, what do you mean a stakeholder? I don't talk to the chair of the management board, every day, obviously. What do you mean by a stakeholder? And I think, oh my God, here we go. Because I say, well, okay, who reads your reports? And people say, well, I don't know really. And then you say, well, what do you put in those reports and who values what you do? And well, the problem I've got is I don't feel valued at all, and so on. And like you're starting right from day one on the back foot. So I first say, look, have a think about who are the people who will take whatever you provide, who would see value in what you do. But the other thing is well, before you know what the value is, you've got to go and meet them and say, look, what do you guys want from me? They are your customers. Literally, they are your internal testing customers, testing stakeholders. So identify who they are, what they're about, what they're trying to do and achieve, which should be common knowledge, but sometimes it's not so clear. And then trying to understand what decisions they need to make. And because the testing is going to help them make better and more confident decisions. So understanding their decision process, what they're trying to get out of the project, how they think they're going to get there, and their understanding of what is really of value and really important and what is really scary to them and what is a real risk and a real challenge for them to get over. Yeah. This is all gold dust to the testing kind of community, like in a project. Because then you can start saying, okay, so it sounds like we need to pressure the developers a little bit more to figure out or to get a better handle on the calculations that are being done. Or the user experience is a bit more important. Or just the end-to-end flow of data and, the whole, linked components, delivering some value at the end of a long chain of events. These are the kind of things that you need to get to understand. Because they give you a steer about what your test strategy should be.
I think if you're confident of, you're using the phrase testers, and I'm sort of slightly wary of that phrase nowadays. I think it's let's just say, I don't know whether the word quality experts, let's just sort of critical thinkers. Let's just think of the tester as someone who's a critical thinker. That's really the primary role. A lot of the stuff that you do with some of your things, it's two boxes on a screen. How do you test it? You've got to be a critical thinker. Now, if you're engaging with a stakeholder, I think, I've done this a lot, is that they don't know what they don't know. So you've got to do a little, engage in a sort of optimistic and positive conversation with them and basically say, oh, do you know that actually probably we're spending 70% of our time hunting for bugs which turn out not to be bugs, and that generally is because of this. And they'll go, oh, I didn't know that. Why is that? And then you're sort of engaging them and say, well, actually it's because maybe when you send some of these things through, we don't particularly have access to some of the pieces of information. And they'll say, oh yeah, we've got that. That's just sitting over here. All right, well, fine. Can we democratize that out? And when do you make the decisions on that? Oh, yeah, we normally have a meeting once a month and then we decide on the new meta rules, Oh, great. Okay, well, it would probably help us out if you could probably, if you could just give us, maybe get one of us to come to that meeting or something like that. That would probably save us maybe 20% of our time, whereas because we're sort of 2 cycles away from you, and maybe try and get them to learn a little bit about what it takes to improve a system and what the effect of what they're doing is upon you. Now that's the best way. There are different ways that you can remanufacture the whole process, but even just getting them just to kind of understand a little bit more. Don't be dogmatic about it. Just say, oh, this, that's interesting. Let me just explain a little bit about what we're spending our time on. And then they might go, oh, okay. And then you're just opening up that dialogue, which I guess is what you're trying to say with that just engaging with the stakeholders. Yeah.
It's easier done in small teams. There's no 2 ways about it. If you are the tester in a large program of 200 people, it's obviously much harder to get contact with the senior stakeholders who, in principle, are leading the effort and so should know what the goals are and should know what their biggest concerns are. But too often they're too far removed from the guys on the ground. However, whoever you work for and whoever he works for or she works for, they're the people who need to have contact and make visible what testers could do to say that we're here to demonstrate things working, but we're also here to demonstrate things not working so we can fix them and improve the quality of whatever's delivered. It's a tough one. As a little anecdote though, if you're I was involved in a relatively small project. There were only about a dozen people involved or so. And it was a kind of a new business being put together, a startup, if you like, being put together by a large financial services business. And the software development was outsourced, the service itself, the people who were going to operate the service, they were kind of outsourced, if you like. And there was really just a project manager, a CEO, a deskaphone, and so on and so forth. That was it. Anyway, so I staged a kind of a risk workshop to try and get to the bottom of the things that were really going to scare, and deflect, if you like, from the success of the whole program. And there were about sort of 7 or 8 or 9 people coming to this meeting that I asked for, and the first person to arrive was the CEO, who wasn't invited. And I said, oh, because I'd met him. I said, okay, oh, thanks for coming. You weren't on the invite. Yeah, why are you here? And he said, well, the things on the agenda are critical to my success as a CEO in this business. So I would be remiss if I didn't show up. So they were he very definitely recognised that the conversations that we're about to have about what we're really trying to achieve and what can stand in the way, what could go wrong, and so on and so forth. He was as interested in the outcome of that meeting as anybody and contributed like anybody else. So quite often people aren't so remote. We don't talk the same language as the guys at the board level. So we don't talk about their business goals and the risks as they perceive them. When in fact, those are absolutely the things they live or die by almost. Their jobs are on the line if they don't meet the goals or the things fails, shot down in flames kind of thing. So once you talk the right language and you make contact with people that recognise what you're talking about, that you're using their language, goals and risks and so on, you're in a much better place. So I don't want to dwell forever on stakeholders, but it's not always possible, obviously.
I think it's an interesting one in terms of mapping out what kinds of things you're trying to prove to stakeholders in the company who might have an interest or be accountable for certain things, right? And because I think when we're talking about testing, a lot of the time we jump straight to functional testing, we jump straight to performance testing, and everything else around that starts to fade away quite a lot. And I think you're absolutely right in terms of, if you went to a lot of teams and said, what are you proving around resiliency? I don't think you get much of a response a lot of the time, but yet, like you say, talking to the language, companies will live and die by the resiliency of their systems, right? But I don't think that it kind of transcends the kind of the low-level development and test approaches into what are the resiliency that's being built into a system, and therefore how does that then translate into what stakeholders are and aren't accountable for, aware of, or want to implement. I think that there's challenges there.
Can I pick up on, just to kind of move slightly off the stakeholder thing and pick up on something you said there, Paul, which was contributed to the meeting. Now, this is a big one with me, and I've been running software companies for a long time, and my wife, I think I've mentioned this earlier in the podcast, said creativity is not jealous. Now, if you're trying to run a meeting where you're trying to come to a consensus, come to an understanding, come to a new idea, I think if we're looking for some advice to give to people who are trying to make changes in organizations, then the running of that meeting, I think, was absolutely critical. And maybe it's something, I've written down here sort of small groups of skills improvements, sort of personal development, etc. But I think one of the ones is actually kind of watching how some people run meetings and pick out the best of them. But the best thing you can do, if you manage to get that CEO in and he or she basically would contributed in a sort of open way, that is massive. That makes such a difference. The number of meetings where everyone's grinding out an agenda, I think we've talked about men being the main problem here, in that you're basically trying to come to a general solution. And if you can not get the egos out of there and actually just try and kick it around, and if someone's being quiet and say, what do you think then? And they might say nothing for a little bit and then nothing, and then they might just come out with one little gem. And I think the best meetings, especially at Grid Tools, I remember this, we used to come out of the room and I'd say, right, we came out with 2 good ideas. Can anyone remember whose idea they were? And they went, no. Which is it's not jealous, in that we managed to be able to come up with some solutions, and they came from really quiet people. Actually, I kind of did write them down quietly in terms of where the genesis of those ideas came from. And if you can run those meetings, then I think a lot of this communication is much easier afterwards, because you've worked on it together. You've got that collaborative spirit. So if there's ways, I don't know whether you know of any kind of training courses that people can go on to sort of understand how you can manage these meetings and not just repeat what the last person said, because they're the boss, which is the big problem with the hierarchies,
But one is, if you've got the ear of the chief executive, which I did on a large SAP project many years ago, but I learned so much from it. I remember going to a meeting of about 12 or 14 people, and it was one of the Indian offshore companies who were basically talking about testing something really quite peripheral to this very large system. It's a $200 million SAP project. And as in my first week, I was told, just go to as many meetings as you can, meet everyone you can, get to know them, whatever. And my role was an assurance manager. So I was there to oversee the testing and to give advice earlier on and to police it later on, if you like. And so I was going to be helping people initially, but also policing what they did a bit later on. So anyway, I went to my first meeting, and one of the things, the culture in that oil company, as it was that if you don't know someone in the room, you either ask for them to introduce themselves or you introduce yourself as the unknown person. So we went around the room, and I got to meet all these guys, and I said, well, I work for, let's call him John Smith, and no one recognised that name until I saw at the other end of the table someone going, I can't do it, but nudging the next person saying, he works for John Smith. And I could see it going around the room. It's like, who was God? And so when I said, I think this test plan is a bit light, I'm an innocent bystander. I'm just looking, whatever. When I said that, they took it extremely seriously, because they realised, crikey, he reports to God, and that is so powerful. So on the one hand, it's great to have the influence of the stakeholders in the room. If you can say, I've got the authority to say certain things and complain, if I'm talking to external folk, but also to say, look, cards on the table, it's a safe environment. We can say anything, if you've got a problem, speak up, let's hear it. And if you've got a solution, even better, let's hear that too. So to me, it's all about being safe. It's about knowing that you're operating with the authority of more senior people, that you can say what you need to say to get things done, to avoid problems and so on. You need to be a very good listener sometimes. maybe all the time. I mean, this is all kind of old hat, you know. So meeting management is an art, I think. Some people have a very, what's the word? Almost like a disciplinarian kind of thing, and just take control of meetings and basically bark at people and just get them to do things, and then it's all over very quickly.
Yeah, but I think I'm sort of talking about the creative meetings here now. If you need to get some decisions made, fine, you lay them out, fine. You know, someone's prepared for it. But I'm talking about your sort of, you know, what's the best way to improve our process, this system, this feature.
Yeah.
You know, that is the kind of thing where I think some training in that space would be really useful, because it pays massive dividends.
Well, you mentioned critical thinking. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned critical thinking, and if the people out there don't know what it is, they should look it up and just find out, because it's where you essentially don't take anything at face value. So if person A makes a statement, you have to understand who person A is and what perhaps their agenda is, where they're coming from and what angle of attack they're coming from in terms of making progress, whether they are a supporter or a resistor to the system, because that person might be managing a big team that's going to be laid off because the software is going to eliminate their roles. So they might not be a supporter. So you have to understand where they're coming from. You also have to understand what their kind of background and mentality is, or attitude is, to software development. They may love software and want to help and contribute. They might be a Luddite and just refuse to get involved, not come to meetings, always negative. You know, so you have to understand that. But the critical thinking aspect is really about, can I take this person's at their word? You know, what they say is what they believe it to be true, and they are truly trying to help. And that goes for everyone in the room. So the information that's shared in meetings and shared on documents and emails and Slack and everywhere else, can you look a little bit further than just the text you see? Because you will find schisms in projects between individuals who may not want to work together but have to because of the project, and people who are really terribly enthusiastic and massive contributors, and other people who really don't. You know, and so critical thinking is about saying, do I take what I'm given at face value, or do I look a bit further into it, into its completeness, its accuracy, its consistency, and whether it's true? You know, so when it comes to requirements, usually we have lots of gaps in requirements that we cannot test against, and you say, well, if I can't test it, you can't damn well build it, you know, to developers, and yet they have a try anyway. You know, they can always, in the absence of requirements, they'll make it up. Now that's a bit of a harsh criticism of developers, but when people are under pressure to deliver, if the requirements aren't good, the developers have no choice but to try and do the best they can, and they will try and build software that they believe meets requirements that may not have been explicitly stated. Now, the tester's got a different problem in that it's very hard to create a test without knowing what the actual outcome of that test would be, just because if you don't have a definition of a behavior, say, any outcome will do, you know, because you don't have anything to compare it with. So typically, testers are great people to have in the room when requirements are being elaborated, discussed, formalized, whatever terminology you want to use. And so the critical thinking comes in is that critical thinkers would challenge the requirements. And by that I mean they don't get annoying with people. They would say, here's an example, you know, here's an example of the behavior of the software. If I do A, B, and C, I think D, E, and F should happen. Is that right? Now, you might make that challenge and give that example, knowing there's a gap in the requirements and the answer cannot be found in the requirements. And that's why you've asked the question. And so by providing examples, it's a non-challenging challenge, if that makes sense. You know, it's not a difficult thing to answer. And what tends to happen is users, analysts, stakeholders, customers, whoever's in the room will either say, you've got that perfectly right. And I'll say, well, okay, I got that from my imagination, not from the requirements. So is there a gap in the requirements? But they might say, well, how did you get that idea? And I said, well, there's no requirement there. So we need a definition of how this software behaves in this circumstance. And occasionally you get in meetings where projects are under threat of cancellation. I mean, I've had one project cancelled because of an awkward meeting where it just hadn't been thought through. And it wasn't a late stage kind of challenge, it was quite early, but even so, the tester's role, I think, and the value of what testers do is they don't take things for granted. They don't say, okay, the requirements are good enough for me to write some code that may or may not work. That's not good enough for a tester. The tester has to have certainty about what the software is about to do and what it's about, what should do, and how they're about to test it. So they have to have a much firmer understanding, a firmer grasp. The interpersonal skills required are asking good questions, being a good listener, an active listener, being diplomatic when it comes to asking some awkward questions and saying, I think we have a problem here because here's an example of behaviours that I think none of us understand because we haven't thought it through, and so on. So there's a whole raft of interpersonal skills coming to play to try and get to the bottom of certain problems, which very often at the start and the early phases of a project are all about requirements. And also saying, has anyone thought about performance? Has anyone thought about security? I've had that. We've all had those meetings where you say, I don't see on anyone's agenda and any documentation anything about reliability and availability and stuff like that. Are these things important? Yes or no? And a tester quite often is the person who asks, because am I responsible for demonstrating that this system it fails over correctly, the availability is up to performance, and the security, and so on and so forth. So getting engaged with the people, as many people as you can, as early as you can in the projects, as you can, by and large pays off. I mean, I think there's a massive contribution to make there.
Rich, anything to add on that?
I'll just go back. I think there's a real strong point around psychological safety, right? And I think the seniors in organisations and seniors in teams set the agenda around the expectation around challenging and candid challenge and things like that. And some organisations have got it right. Some organisations say they've got it right but haven't. Some organisations really don't care. And I think that's a large factor in the ability to, I think, ask a lot of kind of critical questions and kind of go resolve a lot of systemic problems that kind of reside in organisations for long time, and are the ills of so many kind of failed attempts at lots of things we will do in test around kind of delivery and around trying to get things automated. Lots of things. To your point again, I whether those things are strong or not, I think there's always an opportunity, to Paul's point, very early on when projects are forming and storming, in terms of trying to figure out what kind of their blueprints are, to go and ask a lot of questions around, to the point, what is important, what isn't important, to set out the expectation that these questions can either be answered now or they need answering, right? Because if we get too far down the line in a project and that question's never been answered, chances are, by the time kind of delivery is the only thing in the crosshairs, that's going to go way down the list when it gets to kind of, should we resolve this thing? Too difficult. Let's pay lip service to it and fire it out the window. And,
let's
I've seen a lot
the
of
bugs.
projects do that.
I like the one where it was like 652 critical bugs, which just became 652 documentation. They just recategorized them. That was a classic. Very large company. Never mind. Okay, good. I'm just going to bring in one more thing. We haven't really talked about tech here today. Maybe we should do another session on tech and just talk through that. I think you had another session on kind of AI, etc. Now, there's one thing that I think as well with because I've had my 65th birthday the other day. I've been doing this, I think, even longer than you, Paul.
Not so
and yeah, looking at the the good and the bad teams that I've worked with over the years, I think there's a thing that also people sort of forget about, is the balance of the team. In terms of the different types of people that are in that team. Do you have a Snowy, for example, which is from Nationwide, who every team should have a Snowy. It's just
Team Ferret.
when you. So it's like I don't want to bring in, I don't want to get you on football or whatever, but I mean, you don't need everyone to do everything. But you do need someone who's sort of very, very anal or sort of autistic about details, and you inject them into a certain point. You do need probably two creative people. Now, they might be creative in a sort of UI type of way, but they might not be creative in terms of putting together complex chains of systems. But you might have an old hand who's seen everything that's gone wrong in the past. That literally, if we don't get the validation right on our payments messages, which is, I don't know how many times I've seen this one, then all that's going to happen is the bugs are going to, data's going to creep through. It's going to make it through 1 hop, 2 hops, 3 hops, 4 hops. The 5th hop, it's going to pretty much destroy the system. Now, if you can stop that stuff at the beginning, now what you need is kind of an old lag in there who's sort of seen it all and said, look, we really do need to focus on this, and maybe we should focus on a much more rigorous set of rules to reject data before it gets in. And, that's a contribution they would make. You might have then someone who's saying, oh, yeah, we're going to use all this latest cool technology, we're going to do this, that, and the other thing. And you say, cool. That's a really good idea, but let's try and set that up as we're going to go into prototype mode for that. Let's go and experiment the difference between, Kafka and MQ or MQ Lite or whatever it is. Let's just, because what we're hearing from the analysts, who I don't trust at all, is this is, fantastic. But then you go, let's apply a bit of critical thinking on this and do some experimentation. And you put that person on that. And I think having that blend allows you to move along much more effectively. I mean, in Holland, they use colors. I think everyone is allocated a color based on their personality type, and they try and create teams which have all the different orange, blues, reds, etc. So, and you can't have everyone in the same type. And I think it's almost like a transfer system in I've been in America, soccer, football. So where you almost say, look, we've got 3 strikers here, and it's just not really working. So maybe we can move them around between some of the teams. So any thoughts on kind of how? Let's start with Rich on this one, in terms of what you think a good team is.
So I think there's 2 answers to that, right? In that you've got a team that faces into the problem today, and you've got a team that faces into and starts to resolve, and a team that faces into the problems of tomorrow, right? So by that, what I mean is a lot of teams, when they're first forming, I think, will have, if you look at lots of organisations, lots of test teams, they'll have lots of people with a lot of head knowledge, and separately there'll be lots of people that have technical testing capabilities, i.e. the ability to code some frameworks or something like that, right? And those SMEs probably have a lot of analytical understanding. That's great. I have a silo of a test team that knows a lot of things. Okay, what are we trying to achieve? Right, and so by this, you probably, by saying Snowy, you probably focused me on this a bit too much around certain team in a certain situation. Right, so that's great for a time being. We're able to get to a certain place, but we know that's not sustainable. We know that's not. What are our objectives, right? So what we want to do is we want to codify our head knowledge. We don't want it stuck in either testers or that 25-year Unisys person that's been in the organization is just about to retire. We don't want that stuck in their head. And actually what they know is probably limited in terms of its structure anyway. So let's build, back to Paul's model, let's build a model of common understanding of how systems should work, or what we're trying to prove here, right? And how do we then codify that and automate that, because we want to chuck out something as quickly as possible. But we all understand that, that shared knowledge, that understanding, that needs to percolate around the test team. Actually, we've already talked about collaboration. We need to build out relationships with architects, with designers, to make sure that we're not building these things far too late in the development life cycle. They've got skin in the game in terms of what we're trying to achieve as well, and they're not feeling challenged from your thing doesn't work, right? Actually, we want to build this thing together up front. And do you know what? In time, if we're building a model, who cares who builds it, right? We know that we want to get the different perspectives in a room to build this thing, because we all know that there's benefit in getting different lenses, different contexts on this thing, because we all see it in a different light, right? And therefore, if we understand those things, we can build out automation, be that design, build, and test off the back of that. We create a lean pipeline, right, of things that, if it goes wrong, there is collective buy-in around what we did and why it went wrong. So it kind of eliminates the blame game as well. And I think, to my point, we started with a silo of very good individuals, but what we built out is a collective capability that has a collective accountability about it going right or it going wrong. I think is kind of a good evolution, if you like, of a skill set that I think we should be building as a kind of a team delivering test and wider.
Paul, thoughts?
I'm reminded of something called Belkin, the team roles. I don't know if you've heard of that. It's a bit long in the tooth. It's been around a long, long time. But I mention it because it's kind of interesting, I think. I'd hope be an interesting aspect of this, is that people tend to be good at and prefer certain roles. So from memory, I haven't done a Belbin test for decades, I'd say. But like, I think I was a plant, or I think it was called a controller. So I was either a team lead kind of role or the ideas guy. The kind of problem solver. He's the smart guy in the corner. Give it to him, he'll solve it, and that kind of game. Yeah. I was definitely not a completer finisher who basically do all the legwork and get the job done and get it through the door. And there's a facilitator, and from memory, there's someone called a facilitator, I think, or they may have a different name. But they're kind of the glue that hold the team together. They provide like the social context, if you like, of the conversations, meetings, all that kind of stuff, and so on. Now, one of the things about being a consultant, and I mention this only because I don't think people should be too fixed in these specific roles. As a consultant, when you come into a project and you look around, you think there's no leadership here. Maybe that's the problem. Or there's a leader, but there's no thinker. Or there's a leader, a thinker, but there are no completer finishers. Everybody's facilitating, but no one's actually doing their damn job. So you find you get involved in these projects in that way and say, like, somebody needs to go away and do some legwork for 3 days to come up with a spec for the work or a plan or whatever to get this project moving again. And so what I found is, not that I can do every role by any means, but I found myself very often dropping into roles I wasn't comfortable with, but just to get you get called in because something's slipping behind. Okay, well, what can we do to do that? Okay, we need to, in a hurry, get the automation sorted, or we need to, in a hurry, clarify the requirements, get some specs for the testing to be done, so we can move forward. I think
it's actually a really good experience for people as well, taking over those jobs, because you actually do understand the pain. I mean, I remember we did when we were doing CA. We were bought by CA, and I said, well, why don't we try and get the tester, the salespeople to come and be a tester for a day? They were outraged. But anyway, they trooped in to Ensham, and we sat them down, and we basically got them to, we found one screen and just said, okay, off you go, you test it. So we got one there, and they just randomly clicked around and looked grumpy. And then we switched them around and said, okay, I'll tell you what we're going to do now is you're going to test it, and you're going to look at it, and you're going to write down what the other person is going to do to test it. So then they had to kind of do that. And then thirdly, we said, well, why don't we just model it? We'll just generate automation code and test it. And by the end of it, they went, oh my God, that's what people do all day long. And they basically spoke to QA managers for their life, and it was like, oh, so, I wasn't particularly the point of where I started with this, but your comment about, having to put many hats on to solve problems actually is really good experience for everyone. So maybe that's something we should incorporate.
The whole thinking hats thing, I think it's a De Bono idea, where the hats, you get these multicolored hats, like a red, blue, green, black, so on and so forth. And I can't remember, I've very little experience of this, but literally you could be in a meeting and everyone is wearing a certain hat. And by wearing the hat, you say, I'm going to be the ideas guy, or I'm going to be the black hat, I'm going to get this wrong, but in terms of these roles, but my thinking and my attitude to the meeting is to be much more pragmatic, practical, get things done. Another one would be, I'm going to facilitate the conversation, and so on and so forth. So it's a bit like Belbin, but whatever. But every now and then, the leader of the meeting, whoever it happens to be at the time, says, right, let's all swap hats. And then you change your perspective. So I'm going to be the customer now, and I'm going to be the supplier, take the supplier's position, now, So And that gives people different perspectives, which is exactly right. Sending your sales team into the test team. It's a bit like a recipe for disaster, but I'm sure. I think many years ago we did a performance test, but completely manual. It was a help desk application being built in a call center. And it was a brand new building, brand new teams, everybody was new. But the people were there. There were 100 people ready, who were being trained, but also were there to help us with this performance test. So we got them all in the call center. We had an early version of the software. And we brought some salespeople in, and they said, and they all got stuck in. They had a kind of scripts, but they had a free hand there to do quite a lot of what they were doing. And they said they'd never had more fun in business in their lives. They really enjoyed it.
Right, we're running out of time. So, as ever, Paul, it usually goes on for quite a long time in the bar in Copenhagen, and we wake up with a mild hangover the following day because we've spoken too much. Anyway, it's been a pleasure seeing your lovely face again. Thanks so much for your insights. I do feel like maybe we should do another one in a few months and maybe just focus on tech and stuff like that.
Well, plenty of the things we could have talked about.
Anyway, thanks, Rich.
So,
thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Paul.
We'll leave it there. So we're just going to leave. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Why Didn't You Test That podcast. To continue the conversation, head over to curiositysoftware.ie. And don't forget to subscribe for more episodes.